So we've talked about checkerboarding and how checkerboarding uses alternating values to create a certain movement and engages the viewer, right, with having light and dark patterns across our image. But what if we want to direct the viewer's attention to like a specific area? How do we make sure that our focal point is where we want it to be? And this is where value contrast becomes really useful as a tool for creating our focal points. So just by controlling how dark or how light something is within the image, we can just draw our viewer's eye towards that area. It's simple as if we have a dark image and we want, let's say, a few focal points, right? We simply place some lighter patterns, and now the focal points kind of create this kind of rhythm, this gesture to it, right? And what if we changed it to just two? Now they sort of bounce between each other, right? And if we have only one focal point, well, that's where our eye will go to only. So there's different ways to showcase your focal point. You can have several focal points or even just one in certain scenarios. Usually, I like to have multiple focal points in my paintings, and because I like to create some kind of flow and rhythm with the focal points. So I might have like something like this, right? And this kind of creates sort of like a gesture when you draw a line across them. When you connect them, when you average their direction, they kind of create a gesture to it, right? And our eye sort of moves along this gesture when we look at an image like this. So let's say we wanted like a brighter scene. We do the opposite, right? We just simply have contrast with the darks, and these will create a certain flow as well. Same with the one on top, right? But this one is dark and light. Just by controlling how bright something is, or how dark something is, we can draw the eye towards that area as a result of value contrast. And when you do these sort of thumbnail exercises where you place an focal point like this and you make a shape from that, I want you to pay attention to the gesture that these feel. These feel one way, and then this will feel different, because these shapes are kind of like directional this way. Maybe I have one that is focal point here, and maybe it radiates this way, So this is using values, but also shapes, thinking more abstractly, right? To create this like focal points and letting your eye look where you want it to. And then if we can incorporate the idea of checkerboarding into this as well, let's say we can have one area of the image where it's darker and then the other area where it's lighter. And in the darker area, we have focal points by creating light shapes. In the light area, we'll use a dark shape to create another focal point, So this is pretty much like checkerboarding, right? But this is also checkerboarding and using value contrast to sort of guide the eye to where to look. Here, it's obviously a focal point. Here's something we'll look at because of the contrast. This one on the right is obviously another focal point. It's this dark and light, right? I want you guys to really think about this in an abstract way and just think about these dark and light patterns and just ask yourself, what do you feel when you look at these? Because they all feel different, you know. Another thing I want to talk about is like having shape sizes that varies, right? So having like a big, medium, and small shape in your image, as well as using value to create different kinds of contrast, right? So you have the value contrast, but then you also have shape contrast as well. If I have like a big object, and then little object, and then a sort of medium object, this creates variety, and variety creates interest, right? Normally, we want to create variety in our images. We usually don't want things to be the same or monotonous. I want to talk about a way to think of this, that instead of thinking it as big, medium, and small, maybe you can even make the contrast greater by thinking about it as big, small, and tiny. So this way, this level of shape contrast is even greater. You really show how different the sizes are. You essentially make the size contrast even more intense. And I find that in reality, this often happens where shapes can sometimes go from big to tiny very, very quickly. It doesn't always have that middle medium step, right? It kind of sometimes will just go from big to small to micro, tiny, like tiny, tiny shapes. So this is one way to sort of understand just how different shapes can be in a reality and also in a painting, and push that effect even more by thinking in this big, small, tiny kind of way. So if we look at this busy image here, right, there isn't really a clear focal point, I would say. Everything sort of has like the same level of contrast. But if I were to edit this and make this sort of have much clearer focal points, I could just, for one, darken the whole thing, right? And then just simply light, just light where I want the contrast points to be. Maybe I want this person to be a point of contrast. Then I would make this area, light this area up, right? I have this area have a lot of value contrast, and then maybe I have a secondary focal point, maybe this person in the foreground, and then maybe I want this guy on the right to be point of contrast, a focal point as well. So you see how just by me simply lighting these areas up, making them more contrasty in value, we already have distinct focal points, right? This guy, and this. So we have like essentially three figures that are now the center of attention. We can do the same with the reversed versions, right? So if we want, if we want the focal points to be darker and not so bright, we could start like this and make our focal points dark rather than lit up. So this is like another way, right? It's also just value contrast, but it's done in the opposite fashion as we've done earlier. So maybe I want this guy now to be the focal point. And you see how these figures stand out above the rest because of the value contrast. So it's really just that simple, right? So where we have contrast, our eye gets drawn towards. Where we have like very little contrast, our eye tend to not be focusing those areas.